The stars had never seemed so dangerous until the day they arrived. Captain Hyenwu stood on the bridge of the UN's Endeavour, watching his screens fill with red warning signals. Hundreds of them. Ships were appearing at the edge of the solar system. Massive vessels that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built. They came out of nowhere, materializing like ghosts in the darkness of space. Hyenwu had been in space for 15 years. Nothing prepared him for this moment. His hand stayed steady on the controls, even as his heart hammered in his chest. He opened communication channels to Earth, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything for humanity. The alien message came through an hour later. It wasn't a greeting. It wasn't an offer of friendship. It was a demand. The voice that spoke was translated by their computers into flat, emotionless words. The Vulcan Dominion, as they called themselves, controlled 12,000 star systems. They had been watching Earth for decades. They had decided that humanity would join their empire, not as equals, but as workers. Humans would mine asteroids, build ships, and serve the needs of the Dominion. In return, Earth would be allowed to exist. The message gave humanity 72 hours to accept these terms. There would be no negotiation. There would be no compromise. Submit or face destruction. That was the choice they offered. Back on Earth, Admiral G1 listened to the recording 3 times. She sat in the command center deep beneath the Korean peninsula, surrounded by screens showing every military asset humanity possessed. The room was silent except for the hum of computers. Everyone waited for her decision. G-1 had fought in the water wars 20 years ago. She had seen what happened when one group tried to dominate another. She had sworn then that she would never let anyone threaten her people again. Now aliens from across the galaxy were making the same mistake that warlords and dictators had made throughout human history. They assumed that threats would be enough. They assumed that humanity would break. She activated the emergency protocol that had been prepared for exactly this scenario. Across the planet, military commanders received their orders. In hidden facilities on every continent, weapons systems came online. Satellites adjusted their positions. Deep space platforms armed themselves. Humanity had been preparing for this day since they first detected strange signals from distant stars 30 years ago. Dr. Taeyong received the activation code in his laboratory beneath the Gobi Desert. For 3 decades, he had worked on Project Prometheus, building weapons that most people didn't even know existed. The world's governments had poured resources into his work, betting everything on the idea that humanity might not be alone in the universe. Now that bet was paying off, Taeyong walked through corridors lined with experimental technology, directed energy weapons that could disable ships from millions of miles away, kinetic strike platforms that could punch through any armor, AI systems that could coordinate attacks faster than any living mind. All of it had been built in secret, hidden from the world, waiting for the day when Earth might need to defend itself against an enemy from the stars. The 72 hours passed slowly. The Vulcan fleet waited at the edge of the solar system, confident in their superiority. They had conquered hundreds of worlds using the same method: show up with overwhelming force, make demands, and watch the primitives surrender. It had worked every time for 800 years. Ambassador Rekthos commanded the Vulcan fleet. He was a veteran of 50 conquests. He had seen species far more advanced than humanity bow before the might of the Dominion. These humans were barely capable of leaving their own planet. They had no chance against his fleet. When the deadline expired and no surrender came, Rekthos almost laughed. Foolish primitives. They would learn. He ordered his ships forward into the solar system. 60 warships, each one capable of destroying a city from orbit. They moved in perfect formation, engines blazing, weapons charging. They expected resistance. They expected Earth's primitive weapons to make some futile gesture of defiance. What they got instead was something they never imagined. Every Vulcan ship lost power at the same moment. Engines died. Weapons went offline. Life support flickered. Communications went silent. In an instant, 60 warships became 60 floating coffins, drifting helplessly in the void. The crews panicked, trying desperately to understand what had happened. Their systems showed no damage. No attack had been detected. Everything simply stopped working. The EMP network that Taeyang had built was unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. It didn't destroy ships. It didn't need to. It reached across millions of miles and turned every electronic system into useless metal. The Vulcans had never encountered such a weapon because they had never needed to defend against it. Every species they conquered had used the same basic technology that the Dominion used. Humanity had built something different. Before the Vulcan crews could restore their systems, the second wave hit them. Kinetic strike platforms hidden throughout Earth's orbital space fired thousands of tungsten rods. They weren't fancy weapons. They were just metal cylinders accelerated to incredible speeds. But when they hit the disabled Vulcan ships, they tore through holes like paper. Explosions lit up the darkness of space. Ships broke apart, spilling atmosphere and bodies into the void. Rekthos watched his fleet die around him. His flagship systems came back online just in time for him to see the full scope of the disaster. 57 ships destroyed. His crew dead or dying. Only 3 vessels had been far enough away to escape the initial EMP blast. He ordered them to retreat immediately. They jumped away. Leaving behind the wreckage of the Dominion's pride, Hyenwu watched the battle from the Endeavor's bridge. The entire engagement lasted less than 20 minutes. The most powerful empire in the galaxy had sent a fleet to conquer Earth, and humanity had destroyed it without losing a single ship. His crew cheered, hugging each other, crying with relief. They had survived. They had won, but Hyenwu didn't celebrate. He knew what this victory meant. The Vulcan Dominion would not forgive this humiliation. They would not accept defeat. They would come back with everything they had, and next time, they would not underestimate humanity. The war had just begun, and Earth had fired the first shot. There would be no peace now. There would be no diplomacy. There would only be survival or extinction. Admiral G1 stood in the command center, watching the tactical displays show the destruction of the Vulcan fleet. Around her, officers celebrated their impossible victory. She let them have their moment. They deserved it. But in her heart, she knew the truth. They had won the battle, but the real war was coming. The Vulcan Dominion would return, and when they did, they would bring enough force to turn Earth into dust. She activated the planetary defense network to full strength. Every nation on Earth was now united under a single command. Every resource would be dedicated to preparation. Every person would contribute to the defense of their world. Humanity would not surrender. Humanity would not kneel. Whatever came next, they would face it together. They would fight until the very end. The news of the defeat reached the Vulcan homeworld 3 weeks after the battle. Emperor Vothkar listened to the survivors' reports in cold silence. For 800 years, the Vulcan Dominion had expanded without challenge. Species across the galaxy bowed before their power. Now a primitive world had destroyed an entire fleet. The survivors spoke of impossible weapons and tactics they couldn't understand. They spoke of humans who fought like demons. Vothkar's response was immediate and absolute. He mobilized the 5th Conquest Fleet, the largest military force the Dominion had assembled in 2 centuries. 400 capital ships and thousands of support vessels. Enough firepower to crack a planet's crust. Enough soldiers to conquer 100 worlds. All of it aimed at one small blue planet on the edge of the galaxy. On Earth, Commander Jae-Hyen coordinated the evacuation of coastal cities. Intelligence suggested the Vulcans would target population centers first, trying to break humanity's will to fight. Millions of people moved inland, taking only what they could carry. Nobody complained. Nobody refused. Everyone understood that survival depended on working together. Dr. Menesio worked without sleep in her laboratory, studying the wreckage of Vulcan ships that had been recovered. She expected to find technology far beyond human understanding. What she found instead surprised her. The Vulcan weapons were powerful but crude. Their ships were large but inefficient. They relied on overwhelming numbers rather than innovation. The Dominion had grown lazy, conquering species that couldn't fight back effectively. They had never needed to evolve their tactics or technology. This discovery changed everything. Menesio's report reached every military commander on Earth within hours. The Vulcans could be beaten. Their technology wasn't superior. Their only advantage was numbers, and humanity had been preparing weapons specifically designed to handle large fleets. The mood shifted from desperate defense to determined resistance. The Vulcan fleet arrived for months after the first battle. They dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system, just as before. But this time, they were ready for EMP weapons. Their ships had been hardened against electromagnetic pulses. Their formations were spread out to prevent a single attack from crippling multiple vessels. They had learned from their defeat. What they hadn't learned was that humanity learned faster. Admiral Young Ho commanded Earth's defense fleet from the orbital station above Mars. He had spent months studying every record of Vulcan tactics, every scrap of intelligence about their strategies. He knew they would come in force. He knew they would be cautious. He knew they would expect humanity to defend from Earth's orbit, so he didn't defend from Earth's orbit. Instead, he positioned his ships near Jupiter, hiding in the gas giant's magnetic field. He seeded the space between Mars and Earth with thousands of autonomous mines, each one equipped with quantum entanglement communicators that allowed them to coordinate their attacks instantly. He prepared traps within traps, strategies within strategies. The Vulcan fleet advanced carefully, scanning for the EMP weapons that had destroyed their first fleet. They found nothing. Earth's defense fleet was nowhere to be seen. The Vulcans assumed humanity was cowering on their homeworld, preparing for a last stand. They accelerated toward Earth, confident in their overwhelming numbers. The mines activated when the Vulcan fleet reached Mars' orbit. But these weren't ordinary mines. Each one contained a miniature antimatter reactor, capable of releasing energy equivalent to a nuclear bomb. They had been positioned along every possible approach vector, creating a web of destruction that was impossible to avoid. The Vulcan fleet flew straight into the trap. Explosions rippled through their formations. Ships died by the dozens, torn apart by forces they couldn't defend against. The Vulcans tried to retreat, tried to regroup, but the mines were too many and too smart. They moved to intercept fleeing ships. They coordinated their detonations to maximize damage. In the first hour of battle, 200 Vulcan ships were destroyed. That was when Young Ho unleashed Earth's fleet. Human ships emerged from Jupiter's shadow, their weapons fully charged, their crews ready. They struck the confused and damaged Vulcan fleet from an unexpected angle, hitting ships that were already struggling to survive the minefield. Captain Sujin led her squadron in a diving attack on a Vulcan carrier. Her pilots flew with a precision that shocked the enemy. They used the debris field as cover, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. Their missiles were guided by AI systems that predicted Vulcan evasive maneuvers before they happened. Every shot found its target. Every attack left another enemy ship burning. The Vulcans tried to land troops on Mars, hoping to establish a foothold and regroup. Commander Jahan was waiting for them. The Mars colony had been preparing for this assault for months. The colonists had dug defensive positions deep into the red soil. They had set up automated turrets and minefields. They had every advantage of defenders who knew their terrain. When the Vulcan dropships landed, they found themselves under fire from every direction. Human soldiers used the colony's tunnel networks to appear behind enemy lines, strike hard, and disappear before the Vulcans could respond. Sujin coordinated air support from orbit, dropping precision strikes on concentrations of enemy troops. The Vulcans had never fought an enemy like this. Every species they had conquered before simply tried to hold ground. Humans refused to fight fair. The battle lasted 9 days. For 9 days, humanity threw everything they had at the Vulcan fleet. Kinetic weapons, antimatter mines, guided missiles, laser batteries, and experimental weapons that had never been tested in real combat. The Vulcans fought back desperately, but they were fighting in enemy territory against an enemy that refused to follow the INDA rules of galactic warfare. By the end of the 9th day, the 5th Conquest Fleet had been reduced to less than 100 functional ships. The survivors retreated, jumping to faster-than-light speeds and fleeing back toward Vulcan space. They left behind thousands of dead and hundreds of destroyed vessels. The space around Mars was a graveyard of alien technology and broken dreams of conquest. But humanity had paid a price too. Luna Base was half destroyed. Orbital infrastructure was in ruins. 12,000 humans had died defending their homeworld. The Mars colony was damaged and depleted. Earth's resources were stretched to the breaking point. They had won another impossible victory, but everyone knew the truth. The Vulcan Dominion was massive. They could afford these losses. Earth couldn't afford many more victories like this one. Admiral G1 addressed the planet that night. Her face was tired but determined. She spoke about the courage of those who had died. She spoke about the strength of those who survived. She spoke about the future that awaited humanity if they continued to stand together. But most importantly, she spoke about what came next. Earth could not wait for the next attack. They could not sit and defend forever. The Vulcan Dominion would keep coming, keep sending fleets until Earth was overwhelmed. There was only one choice left. Humanity had to take the fight to them. They had to strike at the heart of the Dominion before another fleet could be assembled. The announcement shocked the world. Humans had barely explored their own solar system, and now they were planning to invade an empire that spanned thousands of star systems. It seemed impossible. It seemed insane. But after 2 impossible victories, humanity was beginning to believe that impossible was just another word for difficult. Dr. Taeyang revealed the final secret of Project Prometheus. While the world focused on weapons, his team had been working on faster-than-light travel. They had captured Vulcan navigation data from the destroyed ships. They had reverse-engineered the enemy's technology and improved it. Human ships could now travel between stars, and they could do it faster than the Vulcans. Volunteers flooded recruitment centers across Earth. Soldiers, pilots, engineers, doctors. Everyone wanted to join the fleet that would carry humanity's defiance across the galaxy. They weren't just fighting for Earth anymore. They were fighting for the principle that no species should bow to another. They were fighting to prove that freedom was worth any sacrifice. The first strike fleet began assembling in orbit. Ships built in secret facilities across the solar system. Weapons that pushed the boundaries of physics. Crews trained for a mission that might be suicide. Admiral Young Ho was given command, and he accepted knowing that he might never see Earth again. But he also knew that someone had to strike first. Someone had to show the galaxy that humanity would not be victims. The Vulcan Dominion believed they had time to prepare for the next. They believed humanity would cower and defend. They were about to learn that they had made a terrible mistake. The age of easy conquest was over. Humanity was coming for them. The Galactic Council chambers had existed for 3,000 years, a neutral space where civilizations met to discuss matters that affected the entire galaxy. Ambassador Kyung-mi walked through corridors lined with symbols from 100 different species, her footsteps echoing in the vast halls. She was the first human to ever enter this place, and she could feel the weight of hostile eyes watching her every move. The council consisted of 12 species, who claimed neutrality in galactic affairs. They maintained balance between various empires and prevented any single power from growing too dangerous. They had watched humanity's conflict with the Vulcan Dominion with growing concern. A primitive species defeating a major empire twice was unprecedented. It threatened the established order. Kyung-mi stood before the council, alone but not afraid. She had been a diplomat for 20 years before first contact. She had negotiated peace treaties between nations that hated each other. She had stared down warlords and politicians who thought they could intimidate her. Aliens were just another challenge. The council's speaker, a being that looked like liquid crystal given form, addressed her in a voice that resonated through the chamber. The message was simple and clear. Earth must accept a compromise with the Vulcan Dominion. The conflict was disrupting trade routes and threatening stability. Humanity would be given protected status within the Dominion's territory. They would maintain limited autonomy but accept Vulcan authority. In return, the war would end. Kyung-mi listened, without expression. When the speaker finished, she activated a holographic projector. The council watched recordings of the Vulcan's initial demands: the threat of enslavement, the assault on Mars colony where civilians died, the attempted genocide of an entire species for refusing to submit. Then Kyung-mi presented Earth's terms. The Velkin Dominion would withdraw all claims on human space. They would pay reparations for the lives lost. They would release all enslaved species in their territory. If they refused, humanity would bring the war to them, not to their fleets, not to their outposts, to their core worlds, to their homes. The council chamber erupted in disbelief. The crystal speaker's voice cracked with something that might have been laughter. Did this primitive species not understand the scale of the galaxy? The Velkin Dominion controlled 12,000 systems. Earth controlled one. Did they truly believe they could threaten an empire? Kyung-mi smiled. It was not a friendly expression. She told them that humanity had already proven what they could do when backed into a corner. Now the council would see what humans could do when they went hunting. She left the chamber knowing her words would be dismissed as meaningless bravado. That was fine. Words didn't matter anymore. Actions would speak louder. Fleet Admiral Yoncho stood on the bridge of the UN's Retribution, humanity's first true warship designed for interstellar combat. Around him, 30 ships prepared for the jump to faster-than-light speed. They had trained for this mission for months, running simulations until every crew member could perform their duties in their sleep. Their target was Kelthera Prime, a major shipyard world deep in Velkin territory. Intelligence gathered from captured databases indicated this was where the Dominion built their largest vessels. Destroying it would cripple their ability to replace the fleets they had lost at Earth. More importantly, it would send a message that nowhere in Velkin space was safe. The jump through faster-than-light space lasted 6 hours. Human ships used quantum tunnel technology that was faster than the Velkin method, but required more energy. It was a calculated trade. Speed over efficiency. Strike before the enemy could respond, they emerged from FTL near Kelthera Prime without warning. The planet's defenses were substantial, but designed to stop incoming fleets, not small strike forces. Young-ho had studied Velkin defensive tactics extensively. They relied on layers of screening ships and long-range weapons. They expected enemies to approach slowly and cautiously. Humans didn't approach slowly. Lieutenant Commander Hae-won led the first assault wave, her squadron diving toward the planet at speeds that made the Velkin defenders hesitate. Their targeting systems couldn't track such aggressive maneuvers. By the time they adjusted, Hae-won's ships were already past their defensive perimeter. The attack on the orbital shipyards was brutal and precise. Humans had developed singularity charges, weapons that created brief but intense gravitational fields. When deployed properly, they could crush massive structures into compressed debris in seconds. Hae-won's squadron planted charges on the main construction facilities and jumped away before they detonated. The shipyards collapsed. Thousands of workers died instantly. Half-finished warships were torn apart by gravitational forces that exceeded anything they were designed to withstand. Kelthera Prime's orbital infrastructure was reduced to a debris field in less than 6 hours. The strike force didn't even engage the Velkin defense fleet. They completed their mission and jumped away. Before significant resistance could be organized, the attack sent shockwaves through the Velkin Dominion. For the first time in 800 years, they were under assault in their own territory. The humans hadn't tried to hold ground. They hadn't tried to conquer. They had simply appeared, destroyed a vital installation, and vanished. It was a kind of warfare the Valkyns had never experienced. Commander Jae-hen led the second strike, this time targeting a military command center on the border of Velkin space. His ships emerged from FTL already firing, catching the local defense force completely unprepared. The battle was over in 30 minutes. The command center was destroyed, along with the communications relay, the coordinated defensive, efforts across 3 sectors. Panic spread through Velkin territory. If humans could strike anywhere without warning, nowhere was safe. Fleets that had been prepared to attack Earth were recalled to defend core worlds. Trade routes were abandoned. The Dominion's carefully maintained image of invincibility crumbled. But humanity's attacks revealed something unexpected. On the 4th strike, targeting a mining colony, Captain Sujin discovered that the workers weren't Velkin. They were Krelthians, a species she had never heard of before. They were slaves, forced to work in hazardous conditions with no freedom or rights. When Sujin's forces destroyed the Velkan overseers, the Krelthians didn't flee. They asked to join the human fleet. This discovery changed everything. Dr. Minesio analyzed data from captured Velkan systems and found records of dozens of enslaved species throughout the Dominion. Some had been in bondage for centuries. The Velkan Empire wasn't just an aggressor. It was built on systematic oppression of conquered peoples. Admiral Young Ho adjusted his strategy immediately. Every strike now included liberation operations. Free the slaves. Give them weapons. Give them hope. The Krelthians proved to be excellent intelligence assets, providing information about Velkan defense networks and supply routes. Other liberated species joined as well. The Thasians were skilled engineers who could disable Velkan security systems. The Margathi were fierce fighters who had been waiting for a chance to strike back at their oppressors. Within 3 months, the Velkan Dominion was fighting on multiple fronts. Human strike forces attacked key installations. Slave rebellions erupted across occupied worlds. Former subject species blocked trade routes and sabotaged military installations. The carefully organized empire began to crack under pressure. The Galactic Council watched in horror as their predictions of human defeat proved completely wrong. The humans weren't just surviving, they were winning. They were dismantling an empire that had existed for centuries. And they were doing it with a fraction of the resources the Valkans possessed. Ambassador Kyung Mi received a second invitation to address the council. This time, her arrival was met with silence rather than mockery. The council wanted to negotiate a ceasefire. They wanted to preserve what remained of the Dominion. They wanted stability to return. Kyung Mi's response was the same as before. Earth's terms had not changed. The Valkans would withdraw from human space. They would free all enslaved species. They would pay reparations. The only difference now was that humanity had proven they could enforce these demands. The Council could either support Earth's position or stay out of the way. Back on Earth, civilians watched reports of victories across the galaxy. Ships returned with freed slaves who testified about conditions in Velkan territory. The war that had started as self-defense became something larger. It became a fight against oppression itself. Humanity had stumbled into a role they never expected. Liberators of species they'd never met. Young Ho understood that this changed the nature of the war. They weren't just fighting for Earth's survival anymore. They were fighting for principles that mattered throughout the galaxy. Freedom, self-determination, the right of any species to choose their own path. These were human values, but they resonated with oppressed peoples everywhere. The Velkan Dominion tried to respond. They assembled another fleet, tried to mount a coordinated defense. But their empire was collapsing from within. Rebellions consumed entire sectors. Former subjects refused to follow orders. The military infrastructure that had maintained control for centuries was breaking down. General Boyoung prepared humanity's final assault. The target was Velkris, the Dominion's core world. It was a bold plan, possibly insane. Strike at the heart of the empire and force a complete surrender. The risks were enormous. The Valkans would defend their homeworld with everything they had left. But if humanity succeeded, the war would be over. The fleet assembled near the border of Velkan space. 50 human warships, supported by vessels from a dozen liberated species. It was the largest military force humanity had ever sent beyond their solar system. They jumped toward Velkris, knowing that the battle ahead would determine not just Earth's fate, but the future of the entire galaxy. The fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Velkris system. General Boyoung stood on the bridge of the UN's Liberation, watching as sensors mapped the defenses ahead. 300 warships protected the Velkan homeworld, the largest concentration of military power the Dominion had left. Every ship that could be spared from across their territory had been recalled for this final defense. Boyoung had fought in the water wars on Earth. Back when humanity's conflicts were still contained to one planet, she had seen desperate last stands before. She knew what cornered enemies were capable of when they had nothing left to lose. The battle ahead would be brutal, and many of her people would not survive it. But there was no other choice. The Velkan Dominion had to end here. The cycle of conquest and oppression would continue. The human fleet advanced slowly, deliberately. Bo Young wanted the Vulcans to see them coming. She wanted them to feel the weight of what humanity represented. Not just another species fighting for survival, the end of their 800 years of dominance. Behind the human ships came vessels from liberated species. Krelthian fighters fast and maneuverable. Thasian cruisers with weapons adapted from stolen Vulcan technology. Margothi assault ships crewed by warriors who had dreamed of this moment for generations. They weren't just allies. They were proof that the Dominion's empire had been built on sand. Held together only by fear and force, engineer Sung Ho worked in the Liberation's engine room. Monitoring the quantum drives that allowed human ships to outmaneuver the enemy, he had been part of the team that reverse-engineered Vulcan technology and improved it. Now his engines would carry his people into the most important battle in human history. He ran diagnostics one more time, making sure everything was perfect. The Vulcan fleet moved to intercept. Their formation was defensive, clustered around their homeworld in layers. They had learned from previous defeats. They wouldn't charge recklessly. They wouldn't leave gaps in their defenses. They would make humanity pay for every mile of space. Boyoung had expected this. She divided her fleet into 3 groups. The first, led by Admiral Young Ho, would engage the Vulcan outer defenses directly. The second, under Captain Su Jin's command, would use stealth technology to slip past and attack supply lines. The third group, which Bo Young commanded personally, would wait for the right moment to strike at the heart, the enemy formation. The battle began with a fury that shook the system. Human ships dove into the Vulcan defensive line, weapons blazing. The Vulcans returned fire with everything they had. Space lit up with explosions and energy discharges. Ships on both sides died in the opening minutes. Torn apart by weapons that released more energy than some stars, Young Ho's flagship took heavy damage in the first hour. Hull breaches on 3 decks. Casualties mounting. But his fleet held the line, trading blow for blow with an enemy that outnumbered them. The Vulcans had more ships, but human vessels were faster, better coordinated, and piloted by crews who knew they were fighting for something that mattered. Meanwhile, Su Jin's stealth group slipped through the chaos of battle. Human ships had been equipped with technology that disrupted Vulcan sensors, making them nearly invisible. They reached the supply ships and fuel depots that supported the defensive fleet. Su Jin gave the order to fire, and those vital support vessels exploded one after another. The Vulcan fleet suddenly found itself cut off from resupply. Their ships began running low on ammunition and fuel. The perfect defensive formation started to crack as vessels were forced to withdraw or risk, becoming helpless targets. That was when Bo Young struck. Her group had been circling the battle, waiting for exactly this moment. They came from above the orbital plane, hitting the Vulcan fleet from an angle they weren't prepared to defend. The breakthrough was swift and devastating. Human ships punched through the defensive layers and reached clear space near Valkyries itself. Emperor Vothkar watched the battle from his palace on the planet below. He had ruled the Dominion for 60 years, presiding over dozens of conquests. He had never imagined that his reign would end like this, with human ships in orbit above his homeworld. He sent one final message to the human fleet, filled with rage and defiance. The Dominion would never surrender. They would fight until every ship was destroyed. Bo Young received the message and felt a deep sadness. She had hoped the Vulcans would see reason. She had hoped they would accept that their empire's time was over. But Vothkar's pride would not allow him to bend. Even as his civilization crumbled around him, she sent her own message to the Vulcan homeworld. A single chance for surrender. A single opportunity to end the bloodshed. Any Vulcan ships that powered down their weapons would be spared. Any civilians who wanted peace would be protected. But the military infrastructure would be destroyed. The imperial government would be dissolved. The response came not in words but in action. Vothkar ordered the execution of the human envoy that had been sent to negotiate peace months ago. The execution was broadcast across the system. A final gesture of contempt for human mercy. Bo Young closed her eyes for a moment. thinking of all the deaths that could have been prevented. Then she opened them and gave the order she had hoped to avoid. Target the military installations. Target the command centers. Target the Imperial Palace itself. Show no mercy to those who refuse to accept peace. The bombardment of Valkyris was precise and devastating. Human weapons, refined through months of warfare, struck with accuracy that shocked even their allies. The Imperial Palace became a crater. Military command centers were reduced to rubble. The planetary shields, which the Vulcans had believed were impenetrable, collapsed under sustained fire. But Boyoung kept her word. Civilian areas were untouched. Cities where ordinary Vulcans lived their lives were spared. This wasn't genocide. This was the surgical removal of a government that had caused suffering across the galaxy. The difference mattered. The Vulcan fleet, seeing their homeworld under attack and their emperor dead, finally broke. Ships began to surrender. Some fled into deep space. Others simply stopped fighting, their crews unwilling to die for an empire that no longer existed. The battle was over within 12 hours. The Vulcan Dominion, which had lasted 800 years, ended in a single day. Dr. Jiho arrived on Valkyris a week after the battle. Part of a team sent to document what had happened and prevent further violence. She was a xenarchaeologist, someone who studied alien cultures and histories. What she found in the Imperial archives shocked her. The Vulcans had once been slaves themselves, conquered by an even older empire thousands of years ago. They had suffered under oppression for generations. When they finally broke free, they swore never to be victims again. But instead of building a civilization based on freedom, they became exactly what they had once despised. They conquered others, enslaved them, justified it with the same logic their own oppressors had used. Jiho documented everything, preserving the records for future generations. This was important. Humanity needed to remember that the cycle of violence could corrupt anyone. The Vulcans hadn't started as monsters. They had become monsters by choosing to make others suffer rather than break the pattern. Across former Vulcan territory, liberation movements erupted. Species that had been enslaved for centuries suddenly found themselves free. Some celebrated peacefully. Others took violent revenge on their former masters. Human forces tried to maintain order, but the galaxy was too large and the anger too deep. Ambassador Kiyome returned to the Galactic Council, this time with representatives from 17 liberated species. She addressed the council not with demands, but with a vision. The old order was broken. The age of empires built on conquest was over. In its place, humanity proposed something new, an alliance of free species. Working together for mutual defense and prosperity, the council members listened with mixed feelings. Some saw opportunity. Others saw the end of a system that had maintained stability for millennia. But none could deny that humanity had proven its point. The Vulcan Dominion was gone, and in its place was uncertainty. Kyung Dashmi spoke about the responsibility that came with power. Humanity had shattered an empire. Now they had to help build something better. Not another empire, but a coalition where every species had an equal voice, where might didn't make right, where freedom was the foundation rather than an afterthought. It was an idealistic vision. Many in the council doubted it could work. Species had been fighting each other for thousands of years. Why would they suddenly cooperate? But Kyun Mi pointed to the fleet above Valkyris, where humans fought alongside former slaves against a common oppressor. If that could happen, anything was possible. Back on Earth, people celebrated the end of the war. Parades filled the streets. Monuments were built to honor the fallen. But the celebrations were tempered with reflection. They had won, but at what cost? Thousands of humans had died. Entire alien civilizations had been disrupted. The galaxy would never be the same. Admiral G1 addressed Earth one final time as military commander. The war was over, but Earth's role in the galaxy was just beginning. They had proven that humanity could fight. Now they needed to prove they could build. They needed to show that the principles they fought for weren't just words, but genuine. Commitments. General Boyoung looked out at the stars from her quarters on the Liberation, thinking about what came next. The Vulcan Dominion was destroyed, but other empires existed in the galaxy. Some would see humanity as a threat. Others might try to forge alliances. Earth needed to be ready for all possibilities, to defend what they had won without becoming what they had defeated. 5 years after the fall of the Velkan Dominion, the galaxy looked completely different. The Galactic Council chambers had been expanded to accommodate dozens of new member species. Former slaves who now sat as equals among civilizations that had existed for thousands of years. Ambassador Kilme walked through those halls with a satisfaction she tried hard not to show. Humanity had earned its place here, not through ancient heritage or diplomatic maneuvering, but through force of will, refusal to accept the galaxy's old rules. The emergency session had been called by the Corinthi hegemony, one of the older empires that had watched humanity's rise with growing alarm. They claimed that Earth was disrupting galactic stability. They argued that the liberation of Velkan subject species had created chaos across multiple sectors. They demanded that the Council take action to limit human expansion and influence Kung-me. Listen to their arguments with patience she had learned from decades of diplomacy. The Corinthi weren't entirely wrong. The collapse of the Dominion had created power vacuums and conflicts. Some liberated species fought each other over old grievances. Pirates operated in regions where Velkan authority had once maintained order. The galaxy was more chaotic than it had been in centuries. But Kyungmi also knew what the Corinthi really feared. They ran their own empire, smaller than the Dominion, but built on similar principles. Subject species, limited rights, resource extraction. They saw what happened to the Valkans and worried they might be next. Their concerns about stability were really concerns about their own survival. When it was her turn to speak, Hungmi laid out humanity's position clearly. Earth had no interest in conquest. They didn't want to rule other species or build an empire. What they wanted was simple: a galaxy where freedom was respected, where species could determine their own futures, where might didn't make right to prove this point. She did something that shocked the entire council. She presented complete technical specifications for humanity's most advanced technologies. Quantum slipstream drives that made faster-than-light travel quick and efficient. Antimatter reactors that provided nearly limitless energy. AI warfare systems that had proven devastating against the Valkans. All of it. It's freely given to any species that would join what humanity called the Galactic Alliance. The offer came with clear terms. Any species could access human technology for free. Any species could join the alliance as an equal member. But membership required 2 commitments. First, the complete abolition of slavery and oppression. Second, agreement to a mutual defense pact that would protect members from aggression. The council erupted into debate. Some species called it a trap, a way for humans to gain control through dependence on their technology. Others saw opportunity. The smaller, weaker civilizations that had lived in fear of larger empires suddenly had a chance to level the playing field. Commodore Heinwu, who had been present at humanity's first contact with the Valkans, delivered the technology packages personally. His ship traveled to dozens of worlds, meeting with governments and research institutes. He explained the systems, offered training, and answered questions. Everywhere he went, he emphasized the same message: humanity wanted partners, not subjects. The Krelthians were the first to join the alliance. They had fought alongside humans during the war and had no doubt about Earth's intentions. Their shipyards began producing vessels with human-designed engines faster than anything the Dominion had built. The Thosians joined next, contributing their engineering expertise to improve and adapt human technology for other species. Within 2 years, 43 species had joined the alliance. Some were liberated slaves seeking protection. Others were smaller civilizations that had lived in the shadows of empires. A few were even fragments of the old Velkan military, officers and crew who had seen the brutality of their own government and chose a different path. But not everyone was happy with the new order. The Corinthi hegemony, seeing their worst fears realized, began building up their military. They formed a coalition with other empire-minded civilizations. Species that believed in traditional hierarchies and the right of the strong to dominate the weak. Tensions grew as divisions of galactic civilization opposed each other. Captain, Sujin commanded a patrol fleet along the border between Alliance and Corinthi space. Her orders were clear. Defend against aggression, but do not provoke conflict. It was a delicate balance. The Corinthi-tested alliance resolved with border violations and harassment of smaller member species. Each incident required careful response, firm enough to show strength, but restrained enough to avoid war. The situation came to a head when the Corinthi invaded Praxis Station, a trading hub on the edge of their territory. The station was home to multiple Alliance species, including several thousand humans. The Corinthi claimed it was a security measure. Alliance forces were building military installations too close to their borders. In reality, they wanted to test whether humanity would fight to defend their allies. General Boyung, now in overall command of Alliance military forces, faced a difficult decision: respond with force and risk a war that could consume the galaxy. Back down and show that Alliance promises of protection were hollow. She consulted with her fellow commanders, with civilian leadership, with representatives of allied species. The debate lasted for hours. In the end, the decision was unanimous. The Alliance would not abandon its members. But they would not strike first either. Boyung sent a single message to the Corinthi: withdraw from Praxis Station within 48 hours, or Alliance forces would remove them. The Corinthi response was defiant. They reinforced their occupation force and dared the Alliance to act. Their military leaders believed humanity was bluffing, that Earth wouldn't risk major war over a single station. They were wrong. Admiral Young-ho led the relief fleet personally. 50 Alliance warships, including vessels from a dozen different species, jumped into the Praxis system exactly 48 hours after the ultimatum expired. The Corinthi force found itself facing an enemy that outnumbered and outgunned them. Young-ho didn't want bloodshed. He opened communications one final time, offering the Corinthi a chance to leave peacefully. For 10 minutes there was silence. Then, one by one, Corinthi's ships began to withdraw. Their commanders had studied the war against the Vulcans. They knew what humanity was capable of. They weren't ready to test it. The peaceful resolution of the Praxis crisis changed everything. The Corinthi and their allies realized that the Alliance wasn't just empty promises and idealism. They had the military strength to enforce their principles. More importantly, they had the unity to use that strength effectively. Within 6 months, the Corinthi hegemony requested talks about joining the Alliance. It was a remarkable reversal. Dr. Jiho was part of the diplomatic team that negotiated the terms. The Corinthi would have to free their subject species, reform their government, and accept Alliance principles. It was a bitter pill for them to swallow, but the alternative was isolation in a galaxy that was rapidly unifying under a new banner. On Earth, people watched these developments with mixed feelings. Some were proud that humanity had become a major force for good in the galaxy. Others worried about the responsibility that came with such power. There were debates about how much Earth should intervene in alien affairs, about the costs of maintaining the Alliance, about whether humanity was losing sight of its own needs while trying to fix the galaxy. Dr. Taeyong, now in his 80s and retired from active research, gave an interview that captured the complexity of the moment. A journalist asked him what humanity had truly won through their war against the Vulcans. He paused for a long time before answering. What they won, he said, was the right to define themselves rather than be defined by others. They won the ability to stand as equals among civilizations that had existed for millennia. They won the opportunity to shape the galaxy's future rather than just survive in it. But they also won something more dangerous. It's the responsibility to use their power wisely. He talked about how the Vulcans had once been victims themselves, how they had broken free from oppression only to become oppressors. He warned that the same could happen to humanity if they weren't careful. Power was seductive. It was easy to justify terrible things when you believed you were acting for good reasons. The interview went viral, across both Earth and Alliance space. It sparked conversations about ethics, about the nature of power, about how to build a better civilization. These weren't easy questions, and there were no perfect answers. But the fact that people were asking them was itself a sign of progress. Commander Jae Haein, leading Alliance training programs, worked with new recruits from dozens of species. He taught them not just tactics and technology, but principles. The goal wasn't to make them better killers. It was to make them defenders of freedom, protectors of those who couldn't protect themselves. He emphasized that military force was a tool, not a solution. The real victories were won through diplomacy, cooperation, and mutual respect. Ambassador Kyung-mi gave a speech at the 5th anniversary of Alliance formation. She spoke to a chamber filled with representatives from over 80 species. She talked about how far they had come, how much they had built together, but she also acknowledged how far they still had to go. There were still conflicts between Alliance members, still species that clung to old prejudices, still debates about resources and territory and rights. The Alliance hadn't created a perfect galaxy. It had simply created one where problems were solved through dialogue rather than conquest, where disagreements didn't automatically lead to war. She told a story about her first day in the council chambers. When she had been mocked for suggesting that Earth could threaten the Velkan Dominion, she remembered the condescension, the dismissal, the certainty that humans would be crushed. Then she looked around at the room, at former slaves sitting alongside ancient civilizations, at warriors and diplomats and scientists working together. The old galaxy had believed that might made right, that the strong were meant to rule the weak. Humanity had proven that belief wrong. Not by being stronger, though they were. Not by being smarter, though human innovation had changed everything. But by refusing to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be. On Valkoris, the former capital of the Dominion, reconstruction was well underway. The planet had been renamed New Haven, a symbol of transformation. Velkan civilians worked alongside humans and members of species their empire had once enslaved. The resentment was still there, the pain of recent history. But people were trying, building something new on the ruins of the old empire. Dr. Menesio visited New Haven as part of a scientific exchange program. She met with Velkan researchers who had spent their lives working for the Dominion's military. Now they were adapting their knowledge to civilian purposes, building infrastructure and solving problems instead of designing weapons. One of them asked her if she thought that Valkans would ever be forgiven for what their empire had done. Min-SEO didn't have a good answer. Forgiveness was complicated. The pain was real, the crimes were real, but she told them that the question itself was a good sign. The old empire never asked such questions. They never doubted their right to conquer. The fact that Valkans were now questioning, reflecting, trying to do better, that was progress. Back on Earth, life had changed in ways both obvious and subtle. Children grew up learning about dozens of alien species, studying languages that weren't human, preparing for lives that might take them to distant stars. The sky was full of ships from hundreds of worlds, trading and traveling and connecting civilizations that had once been isolated. But Earth also worked hard to preserve what made it special. Not just human culture and history, but the values that had driven humanity to stand against the Dominion in the first place. Independence, dignity, the belief that every person, human or alien, deserved the right to choose their own path. Admiral G1, now retired and teaching at the Alliance Military Academy, reflected on everything that had happened. She remembered the day the Valkans first arrived with their demands. She remembered making the decision to fight rather than submit. She remembered the cost of that choice. The thousands who died defending Earth and liberating others. Would she make the same choice again, knowing what she knew now? Absolutely. Not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because some principles were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. Freedom wasn't something you could compromise on. You either believed every species deserved it, or you accepted a galaxy where might made right. The story of how humanity went from defending one planet to reshaping the galaxy became legendary. It was taught to young members of every Alliance species, not as propaganda, but as a lesson about what was possible when people refused to accept injustice. The details were debated, the tactics were studied, the decisions were analyzed. But the core message remained simple. The Galactic Empire had tried to enslave humanity. They failed because they underestimated what humans would do to remain free. In failing, They triggered their own destruction and the birth of something better. The age of conquest had ended. The age of cooperation had begun. And it started because one species decided that the galaxy's old rules didn't apply to them anymore.